Hi everyone, this is Myriam Neaimeh from the Alan Turing Institute and Newcastle University. Welcome to our SuperGen Smart Charging webinar. The webinar is an activity of the Vehicle Grid Integration Group at the Alan Turing Institute. The Turing is the national institute in the UK for data science and artificial intelligence. And one of the activities of the institute is to apply data science to real-world problems, such as what we are doing at the Vehicle Grid Integration Group, where we are helping the decarbonization of transport and electricity infrastructure. We have a YouTube playlist of the previous episodes of the webinars, where we cover topics such as regional and national plans for electric vehicle infrastructure rollout. We cover topics on cybersecurity for electric vehicles and communication protocols such as OCPP, ISO 15118, and more recently, talks on EE-bus and OpenADR. Today, I'm delighted to host Laura Jones and Kathryn Lucas-Heeley from the Australian National University. Laura is an experienced innovator and engineer, and she worked across multiple industries, recently on a battery trial, and right now she's working as an economist on the Realizing Electric Vehicle to Grid Services project. Kathryn is working on the social science work stream of the Vehicle to Grid project, and her previous work included reforming the Victorian energy efficiency target scheme, and also she delivered the national ChargeFox ultra-rapid EV charging network. Laura, Kathryn, thank you for joining us so late at your time, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me and can you see my screen?
We do.
Cool. Thank you very much, Myriam, for that introduction. And it was way too flattering too. As Myriam said, I am from the Australian National University in Australia. It is a little late here, but it's always fun to talk to people. You know, I really enjoy that most about this sort of work. I'm an analyst who working on the Realizing Electric Vehicle to Grid Services project, which I will describe a little bit later. And I'm speaking with my sociologist friend, Kat, who will introduce herself as well. As Myriam said, my background is mostly from industry. I worked in distribution and transmission for about 10 years, and I've worked as a consultant for a bit before that, and moved into research in June this year. Because of COVID, it's been a bit of a strange time to move industries and work in a different state to which I live. But it was very nice this week to actually get up and see my colleagues for the first time, to realise that they do actually exist below the shoulders. It's quite nice. Today, I'm going to introduce the project that we're working on, the Realizing Electric Vehicle to Grid Services project, and introduce the Australian power system a little bit for context, the Australian energy system. And then I'm going to talk a bit about V2g and grid services and what the industry and sort of people feel in this space. The title that we've got for this, Making V2g Grid Asset, it's an interesting title, and one of the reasons you pick that is you can actually take that in a few different ways. So maybe it'll be interesting to discuss at the end what our take on this is. So to kick this off, Australia is far, far behind most of the rest of the world in EV uptake. I did a bit of Googling while I was preparing this presentation, and a website told me that, you know, the UK is about 10% of new cars are electric. I can't vouch for the veracity of that claim, but when you compare that to Australia's new car EV sales of around 0.6%, it's still light years ahead. We have a long way to go. Maybe it's because our Prime Minister reckons that EVs will ruin the weekend. Anyway, let's not talk politics. So when Myriam asked me to talk, I was like, what possibly could the UK learn from us? I mean, you're very far ahead of us, but maybe I can just tell you a bit about what we've been up to, and then you can tell me at the end. So what are we doing? next slide. There we go. The REVS vehicle to grid services project is a little 51 vehicle demonstrator of V2g in Australia. It's in the Australian Capital Territory, which you can see I've marked on the map there, because for non-Australians it can be a bit hard to work out where it is. It's that tiny little red dot in New South Wales there. It essentially exists because of an argument between Sydney and Melbourne about 100 years or so ago. These vehicles are going in the fleet of the government of the Australian Capital Territory. So they're being used by people like community nurses and people like that. And the idea is that these vehicles aren't used for most of their life, so they can sort of moonlight as providing contingency frequency control services into the Australian energy market. So essentially, these are the services that try to restore frequency when you lose a generator or load somewhere else in the grid. So they're attractive for these sorts of vehicles because they don't actually require the vehicle to charge or discharge very often. It's usually only after an event, which isn't all that often. At the Australian National University, our role is sort of knowledge sharing. So it's about bringing international experience into Australia and sort of sharing it within Australia and learning, and also taking what we learn in the trial and sharing it with Australia and the rest of the world. This project has been funded by the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. Essentially, this body seems reasonably analogous to Innovate UK in that they provide grant funding to new technologies with the aim of bringing them up to mainstream, particularly renewable energy technologies, of which V2g is one of them. So I'm going to start by introducing the Australian energy system a little bit, sort of at the physical level and sort of what the market looks like in a very high level way. Our power systems are plural. There is not one power system that covers all of Australia, mostly because the distances you're talking about are huge and much of Australia doesn't have a particularly large population density. There are two main ones. You've got the NEM, National Energy Market, which is the bit that's highlighted that covers sort of Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania. That's sort of the biggest one. It's about 30 gigawatts peak demand, and it's pretty long and stringy, which I'll sort of show a little bit later. The other biggest one is the WEM, the Western Australian Energy Market, that covers Perth and sort of surrounds with about a 3 gigawatt peak demand. And then there's a whole bunch of isolated microgrids that you can sort of see. Some of them are reasonably large, and that's usually about mining. And then there's a whole bunch of sort of communities with like microgrids supplying them. I'm going to focus on the NEM in this, just because that's where the project that we're doing is located. The NEM and the Swiss are both, or the NEM and the WEM are both sort of energy markets. They both have quite different designs to them. So the NEM's an energy only market, a bit like Texas. The WEM has a capacity market in there. The NEM, it is an interesting name choice because it's not actually national. It just covers part of Australia. And it's quite a long and stringy network. It's about 5,000 kilometres end to end, and it's got about 40,000 kilometres of transmission line in there. So you can see there's not a lot of transmission line per kilometre on average. We've had sort of a reasonable number of incidents recently of states sort of breaking apart from each other due to faults, in particular relating to the uptake of, you know, distributed resources, wind, all of that sort of stuff. Generation is still 80% fossil fueled, unfortunately, but we've got this increasing mix of wind and solar. Increasingly solar, given Australia is pretty sunny, it sort of makes sense. It's an energy-only sort of liberalised market. There's no capacity market in Australia. There is a bit of talk around the edges. And it is disaggregated in that networks, retail and generation are all sort of separate. The key challenges are sort of common with a lot of other power systems: reduction in system strength from the reduction in synchronous generation, like coal in particular. A lot of that's sort of been decommissioned lately, which is a great thing from emissions, but has made this managing the system a bit more complicated, which so it reduces the fault level and the inertia that you need. The rise of distributed resources, like particularly rooftop PV, is a big thing. Two of the states, Queensland and South Australia, have more than 40% of residential dwellings with rooftop PV. A lot of the areas of the grid have negative minimum demand. In fact, the entire state of South Australia is predicted to have zero minimum demand in the next few years. And this does flavour V2g conversations in the industry a lot, because particularly the distribution networks spending a lot of time trying to work out what they do with all of this solar that's coming into the grid. People don't generally trust the energy sector. I think that's common in a lot of energy sectors. But maybe the high DER penetration is sort of a symptom of that problem. The Australian energy, the NEM is a market, as I talked about. It's an energy-only market. This is just a picture to show how things have changed over the years. So the green is 2010, and it sort of shows about where the energy price is 80% of the time over the year. And the red's the same, it shows about the same. And you can see that the prices have increased quite dramatically, but you can also really see the impact of coincident PV generation in the middle of the day. So you see very low prices at some times and very high prices at other times. But the interesting thing is, even with this variance in price, frequency control is the big thing in Australia at the moment. There is a shortage of it, and you can really see that in the value that you get from market. This plot here shows sort of the financial results of a couple of large centralised batteries that were commissioned in Australia reasonably recently. There's one called Escree, which is in South Australia. That's really designed for frequency control. It is 30 megawatts and 7 megawatt hours. And then you've got Ganawara, which is more of an energy system. It's 25 megawatts, 50 megawatt hours. But even for those, the frequency control revenue is sort of orders of magnitude more than the energy revenue, even with the increase in price variance. And the main reason I bring this up is because our project is producing frequency control services. It's really aiming at that big bar. I don't expect the high prices to last that long because the market's not very big. But at the moment, everyone's thinking about batteries and things because of this impact. So the NEM is a bit of a long, stringy power system with a number of interesting challenges. The question is, how does V2g fit in this space? So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to focus on REVS, the project that we're doing. And the topic of the presentation is about V2g as a grid asset. So what I'm going to do is talk a bit about what grid asset means from a number of different viewpoints. This is going to be what I'm talking about here based on two different sorts of qualitative interviews that we've done as part of this project. I've been doing business model co-design essentially. So basically I've been done 32 interviews with energy and transport sector experts. And it's really focused on the what and the how of grid asset. What does grid asset mean? What sorts of things could V2g do? And how might that work in the future? So there have been 32 of those that I've done. And Kat's going to talk a bit later about interviews that she's done with vehicle users, so fleets, end users, those sorts of people. And this is focused on perceptions and experiences of V2g. And Kat will describe those in more detail a bit later. So what do we mean by grid asset? And I'm going to start at a bit of a high level here. Really, from a grid asset, we're talking about trying to marry two objectives together. We're trying to marry the needs of the energy system, what the energy system would like out of a vehicle providing services to it, and what vehicle users want. They have particular needs. They didn't necessarily buy a car to be a battery. There was one quote that I came out of one of these interviews that I think describes it pretty well. That people want to have a car, the energy system wants to have a battery. Maybe it's a bit hard to find where these objectives meet. So I'm going to start by focusing on the energy system side of this. And I'm going to be talking a bit about these needs and desires components of some of the people who exist in this space. So networks, aggregators, energy retailers, regulators, market operators, they all tend to think quite differently, but within the groups, often they all tend to think quite similarly. So differently to each other, but somewhat similarly within the group. And I'm going to describe this on the basis of these groups. So to start with, it's networks and markets. From their point of view, they're sort of like the grid stewards. They keep the energy system running properly, ensure there is enough capacity to meet people's needs, all of that sort of stuff. When I talk to them, they talk a lot about some of the historical issues that they've managed in the past and they're still managing. So PV, air conditioning, system strength, all of these things have been things that have burnt them in the recent past. Air conditioning came along in the 90s and 2000s and caused large amounts of grid investment to manage the peak demand, which resulted in energy prices increasing. PV's sort of come along maybe as a reaction to these high energy prices, and it's causing challenges of its own in the network. And at the higher level, the amount of studies that you need to do, the amount of things that you need to do to manage system security as a big generator connecting to the market increases exponentially by the year. These people are often fairly impartial and distant from the customer. V2g is just another tool that sits among lots of these things in the cupboard, and which tool you pick up, they're all sort of tried to make the same so that you can use any tool for the same job. And I guess one of the things that was particularly interesting is for distribution networks, network management isn't necessarily demand response. Most of the people, particularly the Australian distribution networks I spoke to, don't ideate a future where there is a lot of demand response going on. They talk about ones where there is dynamic locational prices and operating envelopes that do most of the heavy lifting of managing the distribution network, with customer-facing organisations managing it day to day. The picture that they describe is a little bit like this. You've got operating envelopes that sit inside connection agreements. They essentially tell people you can do whatever you like as long as you consume less than 3 kilowatts from the grid or don't generate more than 2 kilowatts into it, for example, and that changes throughout the day. You have this locational price that tells people how close they are to the envelope, with a little bit of demand response that sits off to the side and sort of covers some of the areas where you just can't get enough grid capacity. And this is interesting because that's quite a different future to what a lot of people who exist more on the energy retail or the more on the aggregator side of the space talk about, where they talk about demand response as being a far bigger part of the services they might provide directly to distribution networks. Energy retailers and aggregators often see V2g as a means of expansion, which is sort of what you'd expect. They're in the business of selling things to people. So, you know, increasing the number of things that you sell to people is a good thing. You have they talk a lot about platform theory, things like Uber, where, you know, they have drivers who pick people up at one spot and put them in another. So why can't you do that with food? Why can't you do that with parcels? Energy markets also are getting more dynamic, so it's increasing their need for flexibility. The quote from the bottom there, load profile is getting worse. I mean, people with rooftop PV, they essentially don't consume when prices are low and do consume when prices are high, which is exactly what you don't want if you're an energy retailer buying energy from the market. And the idea that you can sell services from a particular asset out of both ends is quite appealing, because you can sort of make money out of both sides, which you can see. I spoke to a few people from the vehicle industry as well, and largely they sort of see themselves as helping join the dots for people, helping people pick which V2g offerings suit them, helping people decide whether it's right for them or not. So they don't necessarily see themselves as having a day-to-day involvement in the energy sector. When you put all this together, you've got a future where you've got networks and market that impartially manage the system, retailers and aggregators that provide this platform that sort of people can work on, and manufacturers and fleets sort of guiding the way. But one of the main things, there was a lot of uncertainty. People talked about all of these futures, but largely they said, this is a car. Will people actually want to give up control of this car? Can I count on this vehicle being available when I need it to? And what about the impacts of the vehicle in providing these services? And this leads me to handing it over to Kat, who has been speaking to customers and can help us answer that very question. So, Kat.
Hi there. Good morning / evening, everyone. I'm at my home in Melbourne tonight. Laura's going to be controlling the slides, so I'm going to ask for the next slide as we go. So just to intro myself a bit more, so as Myriam kindly introduced me, I've got a pretty varied background, and I sort of crawled out of technical disciplines into social science via an interest in the people side of things, and that was through a PhD in architectural science. And so my work on the REVS project is really about bringing end user perspectives into the project, and so that's what I'll be talking about now. Next slide, please. So Laura talked about these three key challenges that the energy industry is facing, and that's coming as a result of a lot of structural changes in generation and demand, as well as in declining trust in the sector. Now, all of these issues are in some way related to the decisions and motivations of the end users, whether it's deciding to install solar or batteries at home. It's about deciding when to consume energy, and it's also sort of their relationship with their retailer and other players. And V2g is promoted as an efficient solution that can tackle all of these things, making existing batteries grid assets and creating new revenue streams for industry players. But once again, to realise those things, it also involves the decisions and the motivations of end users. And so that's what I'm trying to understand. And so the point of this is that it's really important that we consider end users as active participants, not sort of passive customers, and that they think about much more than just energy systems. And our work with our team in ANU, we make a real effort to sort of bring social science into as many of our research programs as possible, so that we can sort of make sure we're getting both sides of the coin. Next slide, please. So firstly, I just wanted to quickly talk you through a different project, a different example, because it really illustrates what I'm talking about. This is from some energy social science colleagues at another Australian university, and they've had a recent paper about a peer-to-peer trading trial. And peer-to-peer is, it's another prosumer type model where people can trade their rooftop solar with other participants. And most of the participants in this trial were really keen to be involved because they wanted to learn about the technology and they wanted to be a part of co-creating that new technology. And many of our study participants are the same kinds of people, so they want to be part of making a new technology become available to other people, and they want to have an active role in that. And in this P2P trial, the participants they're enthusiastic about renewable energy and sustainability, more so than they really were about saving money. But having said that, they were ultimately quite disappointed when they saw the model that had been proposed after they'd been consulted, and the network sort of came back with a model because it gave a lower feed-in tariff for solar compared to the status quo. And the benefits were weighted towards the people who use the most energy and the people who had the biggest solar systems. And they didn't think that this was right. And so it was the point to sort of take from that is we'd like to broaden this conversation and make the point that it's not about the amount of money per se. It's about knowing that the flows of money are aligned with the things that people perceive as good. And so in this case, they thought more renewable energy is good and lower energy consumption is good. And so the benefits should reflect those values. And these are really important because in this sort of clash of expectations, it meant many people dropped out of the trial after that initial consultation. And I think that, and we find across a lot of our research that these themes are quite common among Australians. Next slide, please. So the social research in the REVS trial, the results I'll share today are just from two of my participant groups. So it's a subset of the data I've collected to date, and the data collection is a work in progress as well. I'm calling these two groups future users. And so, like I said, they're interested in co-creating, and they're kind of, if you like to think of it in terms of the adoption curve, they sort of sit around the user legitimators or the user intermediaries sort of part in that kind of adoption. And so these, like V2g is not available in Australia yet, but these are people that kind of see themselves as maybe being really interested, when that comes about. Of those two groups, the fleet users, these are fleet energy and sustainability managers in organisations that are in the process of transitioning their fleet to zero emissions. And so far, pretty much all of the ones I've spoken to have been local and state and territory governments. And I think that the fact that those are the groups that are transitioning is important in and of itself. And the private user group are people who already have an EV or they may be thinking of getting one. They're homeowners who are also doing things like installing solar as well as a range of other things. And that group is pretty evenly split by gender and includes everyone from sort of millennials to retirees. The methods I've used is loosely structured interviews. So these are going for depth rather than getting a large number of participants involved. So it's purposive sampling, and it's about giving them the space to talk about their aspirations, their views, and to broaden our thinking about what users might be seeking. And so far, I've got insights from 13 today, and yeah, that's a growing data set as we go. So this is a bit of a sneak preview. Next slide, please. So just starting talking about the fleet users. These organisations are transitioning because of carbon reduction goals that their organisations have committed to. And a significant part of meeting those goals that they've set for themselves is their fleet. They account for a lot of their emissions. And a lot of them, they have fleets that are made up of light commercial and heavy vehicles as well. And so they're sort of starting with the light passenger vehicles because those are the EVs that are available. But while that process of transitioning the fleet is by no means simple, that's the easiest and possible part of that job at the moment. And so there's a real dimension of prioritization and timing of like who might be interested in V2g and when, and will V2g actually be available in Australia at the right time for them. Those fleets are used for core businesses. So they're not buying the cars so that they can do V2g. They're buying the cars so that nurses can visit patients, office workers can go to meetings and things like that. And this sort of really contrasts with things like where these organisations might be putting solar on their roof or doing energy efficiency measures, because those things don't affect their core business. They're not intersecting with them. And there's always other sort of motivations for these types of organisations as well. So local and state governments are really interested in economic development, job creation, other aspects of sustainability like waste and that sort of thing. Next slide, please. So what we sort of hear talking to them, one of the first things is people can quite easily see that the idea of using an underutilised asset, a car battery while the car's not being used to run the electricity system, sounds like a really good idea. In theory, it makes a lot of sense. But when they think about it in the context of their own operations, it's really easy for them to come up with reasons why it won't work. This means it's not a simple task for V2g to find its place. They tend to sort of see their own barriers, but they imagine someone else's barriers aren't as high. So they're probably a better sort of target group. But then if you talk to that target group, they kind of say the exact opposite. So that was quite interesting. Next slide. The other thing that we heard from the fleets is that organisations that serve communities have many issues to think about. And so when they're faced with a decision like transitioning to zero emissions vehicle, they need to judge that new technology by today's expectations. So it's not just, shall I buy a combustion vehicle or should I buy a battery electric? So it means they're thinking about broader things like lithium battery disposal. And they're also really interestingly, I thought, considering things that they're not actually responsible for. So for example, local government people I've spoken to are really keen to make sure they're doing the right thing to keep their local grid sort of strong and making sure they don't have blackouts. But that's not their job. And from the energy network's point of view, they're just another customer. When they're thinking about transport, they're also thinking about broader ways to tackle congestion and support the community to be more sustainable. So things like neighbourhood planning and public transport might be bigger priorities because at the moment, especially in Australia, more people benefit from that. And those are really important measures for tackling climate change as it is. And so the point is they're not sort of comparing ice apples with electric oranges, if you'll let me draw that for you. They're comparing it with a whole basket of fruit. They're thinking about so much more than this car versus that car. And the V2g proponents are not necessarily thinking about things in that terms, and I think they need to engage with those broader conversations. That's what that's sort of telling me at the moment. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about the private EV owners or prospective EV owners group. So these people so some of them had already bought an EV, some were leasing one, and some were thinking about doing it. There were also people who were on a bit of a journey. So they were driven by their, once again, goals that they'd set themselves to reduce their environmental footprint and be an example to others. And that might have been they wanted to be net zero in energy. They were doing lots of things much broader than energy. So they were growing their own food and doing permaculture. They were making sure their housing was designed to be energy efficient and also suitable for people in different life stages. They were divesting their superannuation and banking from sort of fossil fuel interests, and doing things to sort of reduce their own waste and that kind of thing. And so the EV is just one technology substitution that forms part of a bigger picture for them. And a lot of them was sort of getting rooftop solar installed and sizing it a bit bigger with an EV in mind, so trying to account for that future energy consumption. Next slide, please. They, rather than sort of, there are a few studies out there that are trying to put a number on the sort of dollar amount that people are willing to pay or expect to save through V2g. Whereas the people that I've spoken to so far have really emphasised that what's important to them is feeling as though they're being treated fairly in that kind of deal. And the trust of energy retailers really comes into that issue. I had quite a knowledgeable participant who was talking about bargaining position, and that's that second quote there. They just felt that they would have no leverage as an individual, and so they were sort of speculating, you know, some other kind of ownership model or facilitation by a trusted group such as a local council, rather than just being a price taker, as they put it. And so I think that opens up the conversation for V2g about the technology being developed with different governance and ownership models in mind, as well as the sort of the aggregator retailer offering model. Next slide, please. Another quite interesting thing I found is that, so if people are kind of, they've set their goals, they're coming up with their plans, sizing their PV system and their batteries, and it means that their battery is actually an important part of their overall energy plan. And say if they're trying to aim to minimise their imports and exports to and from the grid, and be net zero, having V2g instead of a home battery seems to them as a bit of a part-time alternative. And this sort of expression that we're hearing quite a lot in Australia, and I think elsewhere as well, of a battery on wheels, it might actually have a bit of a negative connotation, because a battery on wheels is a battery that can disappear and be absent. So I think there's just a little note to maybe be careful about how we sort of define this sort of technology using these kinds of really approachable language, but it's maybe not giving me an attractive impression. Next slide, please. Thank you. There's another thing that has kind of struck me quite recently, looking at the interview data that I've got so far, is that among these people, like, they're a pretty knowledgeable group. They want to, they understand sort of energy flows, and I don't know if you have the expression the duck curve in other countries, but the duck curve is very well known among sort of people with a passing interest in energy here, in that the huge levels of rooftop solar have changed our sort of residential load profiles so that it allegedly looks like a bit of a duck now. But people don't necessarily know about the problems, the types of things that Laura was describing, that the energy systems facing, such as the need for fast frequency response. And so people are sort of trying to help and contribute with what they're doing. But that's in line with their understanding of the problem. And, you know, it's their assets, it's their systems and their cars and stuff that are behind their meters. And so it's them that are kind of, you know, behind the wheel. It's really hard to avoid car puns, I'm finding increasingly. But, you know, they're behind the wheel and they're the one who's deciding, but they're formulating the problem as they understand it, and they don't necessarily understand it in the level of detail that is likely to make V2g stack up in Australia. And this kind of comes back to the trust thing as well, because people want to be in control, they want the power. And so it makes it a bit harder to prosecute the public good angle of other grid services. Things just get more complex, I guess. And so there's a few challenges here. And the next slide, please. So, okay, I've created lots of problems here. What should we do about it? I think, first of all, we should recognise these cohorts of people that want to be a part of co-creating new technologies. They have their hearts in the right places, or they're driven by climate change goals, whether they're householders or organisations. And so they want to help this technology find legitimacy, but I think we have to be careful that we're not only engaging sort of those people who are sort of more financially driven than values driven. I think it's important that as an industry, like we're just one trial, and I hope that there's many more trials in Australia that they really experiment with and allow different bidirectional charging arrangements. So not just V2G, but V2 whatever, and also ownership and governance models that are a bit more empowering to end users and meet their needs, put their needs first, I guess, rather than the grid needs. And this is really sort of addressing some of those barriers that they've identified. And then just sort of lightly to take heed of this sort of advice and think twice about how benefits and solutions are framed to people, because as Laura sort of pointed out, they might not be sort of really aiming for what's needed in order to bring these two parties together and get V2G in Australia to be more than just a cool idea. And so I think it's just the end slide now with our contact details. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kat. Thank you, Laura. If our participants have questions, then if you can please leave them in the chat box and we'll read them out. Meanwhile, I wanted to ask something about your setting. Usually we have parties interested in having V2G chargers and having some trials, but it's not always easy to get a hand on the technology. If you're able to share with us, can you give us some detail on the chargers, the makes, how you managed to get them, why you chose them?
I think at the most we can just share war stories of not having them. So we are using the Wallbox Quasar charger for the trial. Australia's got a different grid code to the rest of the world, because of course we do. And that means that they need to be certified against that specific standard, and that process has proved to be more complicated than we thought it would be. So in Australia at the moment, you can't buy a V2G charger that you can legally connect to the grid and discharge. But hopefully that will be rectified in the future. It does seem that the manufacturers are generally pretty busy because there's a fair bit going on in the V2G space, and Australia is a very small market, so it's not generally a market that manufacturers are champing at the bit to access, because we don't have a great deal of EV uptake.
Okay, and so Quasar, Wallbox Quasar is what you used. They had to maybe adapt the charger for specific certification requirements in Australia. What about the cars? I'm assuming it's just Nissan using the CHAdeMO protocol?
Yep, it's just the Nissan Leaf using the Chatamo protocol that we're using in this particular trial. It's the only vehicle you can get in Australia that supports V2g within the warranty. So Nissan is a partner in our project. So yeah, they're quite keen and interested.
And your project funding is paying for the cars and the chargers?
It's co-funding, so it pays for part of the cost. I think I might have had right in the initial slide, so I'll just go back to the project specification slide, which has got all this stuff on it, I think. Yep, so Arena funded $2.4 million toward the $6.26 million project. So essentially, largely they're sort of paying for wages, the charges, and some of the cost difference between a non-V2g vehicle and a V2g vehicle. You've also the partners on the bottom there, so I probably didn't describe the partners in the slide, but we've got us. Actu-AGL is an energy retailer. They're the lead of the project. ACT government, they're the people where the vehicles are going. Us, Australian National University. Evo Energy is the distribution network that covers ACT. Jet Charge is the charge platform provider. So they're essentially providing the smarts that plug into the cars to make them respond to the frequency. So the chargers don't respond to the frequency natively. So they're providing a box that does that together with like the charger management platform. Nissan, I think we all know who Nissan is. SG Fleet are a fleet provider. So they are the ones who sort of do leasing and management of vehicles on behalf of people like ACT government.
In the report, the Renault Zoe was mentioned, and as far as I am aware, a Zoe does not use a CHAdeMO, uses ISO 15118.
Yeah.
Some demonstrations that Renault did. So are you able to communicate with a Zoe if you had access to a Zoe?
We could, but well, the controller that's built specific for that particular charger, the challenge of the Zoe in Australia is you can't actually buy one. They're not available in Australia anymore, so it's pretty hard for us to get manufacturer support for a vehicle they don't sell.
Okay. So just to wrap up on this point, for me to understand, you have Jet Charge who's controlling those chargers, like acting as the aggregator, providing the services to the grid.
They're probably the technical aggregator, so they're providing the technical layer. Actu-AGL, the energy retailer, they're the ones who are providing the services into the market.
Okay, yeah. And are you collecting data from the cars, from the chargers?
Yes.
Yes, it's not so easy in the UK to get access to that data. How have you been managing?
Well, we're fortunate in the fact that ACT government are the owners of the vehicle, and they said we can have the data because they're project participants. Yeah. So basically, they've given permission to Jet Charge to give us data. We also get a bunch of data from SG Fleet too. So SG Fleet have a telematics solution inside these vehicles and a booking system. So we get data from that too. So we know when vehicles are booked. And essentially we know when they move too, which does mean that we do have quite a lot of data on how these vehicles are used, which is quite nice. Yeah. Even the vehicles that are not electric. So we've got data of the ICE vehicles they have in their fleet too.
Yeah, that's excellent. I'm assuming you have loggers installed on those cars collecting this.
Yeah, so they have loggers installed anyway. That's what SG Fleet does. So.
Yeah. And yep. Another thing we're finding hard in the UK is getting data on battery to understand the impact on degradation. Do you have plans to look into that? And what data are you able to collect for that?
Not in this trial. We don't have any battery degradation sort of collection happening in this trial. It'd be something that'd be good to look at in the future, but at the moment, no.
Okay. So moving on to V2g Smart Charging, are you considering smart charging, like smart charging with the rise of PVs, or are you just jumping to V2g? How do you price those V2g services? Are you only considering frequency response? What about services to the DSO?
Yep. So we're considering frequency control mostly because it's the thing you could convince ACT government that you could provide with their vehicles without leaving them flat. Because obviously they're concerned that the vehicles will be not charged when they want to use them. So because contingency frequency control doesn't need to do anything very often, it's not continuous service, it only happens after faults. it sort of reduced the risk a lot from the government's point of view for their vehicles. So the vehicles are essentially convenience charged, just because EVs are fairly new to them. There are other trials that are looking, and feel free to jump in, Kat, if you'd like to add your bit into this too. I'm aware that I'm talking way too much.
Yeah, I was just going to mention there's another trial that is also ARENA funded through a different group, although they have some of the participants in common with ours, where they'll be looking at smart charging. They'll be doing things with Teslas as well, and it's more energy retailers, relationships with sort of private EV owners, that one, and not V2g so much.
Yep. And there's another one that's looking at distribution networks as well with our retailers. So yeah, we're a bit unique that we've got both of them in the trial. So distribution network services. So there is another trial that's being run by some distribution networks that's looking at those sorts of things. As I mentioned in my talking later, distribution networks in Australia often don't see themselves as being large procurers of grid services. They generally expect that they'll use network pricing and things like operating envelopes that sit in the connection agreement to largely manage their network.
Thank you. I'll take a question from the audience. Peter, the floor is yours.
Well, hello there. Yes, Peter Bates here from Ely in Cambridgeshire. I was interested in the point that was made about private EV owners being fairly compensated, because although that I think is a very important point that needs to be raised. I mean, I'll put it into context in the UK context. There have been a few trials going on with vehicle to grid. I mean, I, as a private householder, would love to get onto one of these trials, but there are certain limitations which have been actually kind of which limit me to actually use these trials. For example, there's one trial currently going on where you actually have to lease an electric vehicle in order to do it, and the conditions related to leasing that electric vehicle aren't particularly good. The owner is also compensated, but the actual project is stipulating a price which they are prepared to pay you for doing it. Yet in the UK context, and I'll give you an example with my own property. I mean, I've had solar thermal for about 18 years. I've had solar PV since 2013. I have a home battery storage system, which is a 15 kilowatt battery storage system. I also use one of the currently very few utility providers who actually provide me with, which is Octopus Energy, and they provide me with an agile tariff. So actually I can select what price I want to use electricity at certain times a day. Well, correct it. I get provided with the price, and then I can select whether I wish to use it to store my electricity in my battery. I want to do the same thing with my electric vehicle. In fact, I've just bought an electric vehicle since November, and I did buy it with the purpose of it having a battery charger and using that for vehicle to grid. But what I'm currently finding in the UK context, and I think it's an issue maybe that may be addressed in other projects throughout the world, including Australia, is that the conditions set by the project are actually really quite limiting. There's a certain amount of vendor lock-in occurring in terms of you've either got to use a certain type of tariff, or you've got to actually use a certain type of kind of battery system in that respect. So I think that is issues that do need to address. I mean, the evidence also appears to be coming clear that in terms of battery degradation, that isn't an issue. So in many respects, it is a win-win issue as far as the distribution service provider is concerned, in terms of they can actually help to balance the load as far as vehicle to grid is concerned. it's a win-win situation as potentially as far as householders are concerned, particularly those who actually have their EV battery sitting on their driveway for 97% of the time. It's a great way to better optimizing that, and equally so it's a win-win situation in terms of decarbonisation is concerned. So I'm just wondering, in terms of a question, what other experiences have been occurring in Australia related around this space of the limitations related to trials and actually the limitations in terms of having access to vehicle-to-grid chargers?
Yeah, I think, Peter, you raised some very similar points to a lot of the people that I've spoken to, where, you obviously a very well-informed person with, ideas about how things ought to be. And when an offering comes your way, it doesn't really align with those views. And that's the sort of thing that we'd like more and more industry people to appreciate with end users. With regards to trial, I think the issue of lock-in is a really important one as well, because sometimes trial participation means having to go with a retailer that might not be your first choice of retailer. Particularly in Australia, our larger retailers who are the ones that sort of have the capacity to do these big trials are often the ones that are gentailers and own lots of fossil fuel assets and stuff like that. And sometimes people aren't very comfortable with that when they're the type of people who are really trying to be a part of, the clean energy transition. And I guess my final comment with sort of trial participation generally, we had a really good discussion with our consortium about the types of feedback our distributor on our project was getting from a different trial where people were sort of given incentives to install a home battery and participate in a VPP. And they were like, they seem really happy to do it, but they're also getting pretty generous incentives to help them install a home battery, which maybe they were going to do anyway. And so, and also from feedback from my own participants is they might be more interested in participating in a trial, but they might not really want to be a customer in future because it's not the same situation, it's not the same relationship that you're having. And so I guess those examples kind of are a little bit counter to your experience where it appeared like the trial participants were getting what felt like a bit of a raw deal. And I think that stuff's really important. And I think, industry has to really try and put itself in other people's shoes and not just sort of put together something and decide that they know best, which is what we're hearing again and again with all sorts of different technologies.
Great, thank you, Kat. Thank you, Peter. By the way, Peter, Paul might be recruiting you from the Electric Nation trial, so check if you can go on that trial if you're in the WPD supply area. Before I actually take a question from Paul, a quick question on the communication protocols for that aggregator. Are you using any standards like EEBus or OpenADR to control these chargers, or are you developing something in-house?
So there's a couple of different communication protocols going on. Between the charger and the jet charge control box, it uses OCPP to do that control. Between the control box and the jet charge cloud, it's a proprietary protocol. So there's also communication that goes between jet charge and ActuAGL, which is how they're bid into the market. That's also sort of proprietary, but there's also a link between the distribution network and jet charge, which relates to these operating envelopes that I talk about. So the operating envelopes are being used in this trial. Essentially, it's the sum of the charges can't exceed particular values. Those are sent between the Australian National University and jet charge using 2030.5 as the base protocol.
Great, thank you. And I do encourage people to check out both you and Kat's document, by the way, on V2g, where you talk about a lot of the issues that are relevant to the topic. Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you. Shall I put my video on? There we go. And then you can. Thank you very much, Laura and Kat, for a brilliant presentation. Really enjoyed that. I'm going to ask you a speculative question, if I may. So, imagining a future world where all of the technical challenges are put to one side and cars have V2g on board, and you just plug it in and it just works, and there's no wall box needed and all of that. So, in a future world, I was really interested in your thoughts on the attitudes of people to V2g. In that future world where V2g capability is ubiquitous, do you think users will care, or will it be just something that happens in the background? You know, is it something they're going to be actively involved in and get paid for, or is it something that is invisible to them? I realize that's very speculative, but given the interviews that you've carried out, I'd love to hear what sort of real users think about this.
I can jump in on that one if you like, Laura.
Yep.
I think that part of the research that I've done as well is a lot of documentary analysis of infrastructure planning and policy that's coming out of all of the different jurisdictions in Australia, so all the states and territories as well as national. And I think the impression I get from that is I've sort of formed a view that at some point that if you're connecting a charger or you know, you're charging your EV in Australia, that it needs to have some kind of smart control on it so that it can be managed. I think I feel like I've broadened my outlook to look at bidirectional charging in general, because I think there's a lot that's potentially really attractive about things like more vehicle to building or vehicle to load that I think could really appeal to people. I think V2g could end up appealing to people who are sort of more financially driven and want to get like a good charging deal at home, and that people will sort of fall into it. They'll get used to it and it'll stop worrying them about the barriers. But I think they'll, I guess what I'd like to see is a lot of different options in Australia and more sort of local use cases, rather than Australia gets described a lot as technology takers with this kind of stuff, where we're sort of stuck with what we can import. But I think there's opportunity for Australia to do some Australian things as well, designing things to our own standards for our own use cases and appealing to sort of a lot of the kind of the flexibility and freedom of vehicles and that kind of thing. So it's probably a rambling response, but I think there's sort of if I was going to place it there, I'd say at some point that our standards, our appliance standards, would say that there has to be some kind of smart control of EV charging, and it doesn't necessarily have to be particularly smart. It just has to be something.
Yeah.
No, if I can stay a little bit of rambling on to the end of that as well, if people don't mind. So I guess I can talk a bit about what the industry talk about when they talk about, you know, V2g becoming ubiquitous. And, you know, people talk about a lot of things, like this idea that you use a car like a credit card and use it to pay for parking by traveling little lumps of flexibility around with you. And, you know, there's also the people who say, oh, it'll never happen, you know, it's just too much work and why do you bother? And then, you know, the hardcore pricing fanatics that talk about that you're going to see price boards that say you should plug in here and charge and then drive here and discharge because you're going to make money. It all tends to be very financial driven. When you talk to industry and I say, so what do people want? You know, people say money and that's all. And it's really refreshing to hear Kat's research that's quite different to that and more nuanced.
Yeah, no, I really love the differentiation between vehicle to home, which might be quite compelling because it's powering my home, but vehicle to grid, I don't really care about that. You know, it's more than just the fact. So thank you for that. I'll be eager to learn a bit more about what people said. Yeah. Thank you.
We've seen some really interesting stuff, like people say retirees that are spending a lot of time away from home, and being really, and they have a battery and they're using an aggregator to sort of earn money from it, but they were really unimpressed that they had to leave their modem on while they were away from home for a couple of months, because like the battery aggregator system needs a Wi-Fi signal in order to communicate, but they're trying to save on standby power. So they just find it really, really counter to what they're trying to achieve. And so there's all sorts of things like that we don't really count on when we're thinking about the commercialization of these technologies.
Yeah, I think actually when you say that, the other thing that comes to mind was what's happened recently about, you know, little things can often be the big challenge. Like we've had this interesting discussion with the project partners about there's a whole bunch of vehicles that are used by on-call that aren't generally booked. And that ends up making it quite hard for people like ActuAGL to bid into the market when they don't know when vehicles are going to be available. So you do end up sometimes with this clash of different people's needs and desires and how they use things. And it can end up as a surprisingly big issue sometimes.
Great. Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you for the participants, and a big thank you for Laura and Kat. Anything else you'd like to add, and how can people reach out to you and know more about your work?
So I'll just go back to the end again. Email addresses at the end of these last slides. So always happy for emails from people. Always happy to chat to people. We just published a report. The link isn't on here, unfortunately. I'm happy to send it to you, Myriam, and send it to all of the participants we did the A to Z of V2g report. 166 pages of riveting V2g information. And I'm also keep an eye on the website, bsgip.com. I'll send that around as well, which we'll have all of our reports published together with the other work that we're doing in various other projects. So we've got a lot of work going on in things like operating envelopes, that sort of space as well. Yep.
Thank you. Great. Okay. I sent the link to the report in the chat box, and thanks again. Goodbye.
Thank you.